My mother handed me a bright pink plastic piggy bank with a $1 price tag still stuck to the bottom. We were standing in the center of her sprawling Atlanta living room, surrounded by 50 extended relatives who were sipping expensive champagne she could not actually afford. She looked me dead in the eye and announced to the crowd that since I was 35, single, and married only to my spreadsheets, I needed to start saving for my lonely retirement. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply smiled and took the plastic pig, because just 1 hour later, I would be driving away in the $80,000 midnight blue BMW my parents had just gifted my sister, a car they had no idea I legally owned. My name is Jada. I spent the last 10 years building my own corporate wealth management firm from the ground up. I did not yell when my mother handed me that piggy bank, because I knew something she did not. If you have ever had to use cold, hard facts to destroy the family members who tried to break you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from, because you are going to want to hear exactly how this Christmas Eve ended. It was exactly 11:30 at night, and the atmosphere inside my parents' house was suffocatingly artificial. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta meant that appearances were everything to my parents. My mother Valerie and my father Desmond had spent decades cultivating an image of generational wealth and untouchable success. Their house was a massive, heavily mortgaged McMansion with towering ceilings that cost a fortune to heat and imported marble floors that echoed with the sound of their mounting debts. They threw lavish parties, bought designer clothes, and leased luxury vehicles, all while quietly drowning in a financial sinkhole of their own making. As a wealth manager, I respect capital. I understand the quiet power of compound interest and the security of a diversified portfolio. My parents respect only the illusion of wealth. Because I refused to fund their country club memberships or co-sign their ridiculous loans, I was labeled the stingy, selfish daughter. Tonight was supposed to be their ultimate triumph over me. They had invited every aunt, uncle, cousin, and influential neighbor they knew to witness their grand display of prosperity. The annual Christmas Eve gift exchange in our family was never really about giving. It was a theatrical performance designed by my mother to establish a hierarchy and send passive-aggressive messages. We were all gathered in the great room where a 12-foot tree dripped with silver and gold ornaments. A catered buffet line stretched across the dining room, offering prime rib and truffle potatoes that my father had likely put on a credit card with a 24% interest rate. I stood quietly near the fireplace, wearing a custom-tailored emerald green pantsuit, holding a glass of sparkling water. I watched the spectacle unfold with the detached calculation of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. My mother called for silence, tapping a silver spoon against her crystal flute. She moved to the center of the room, her eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto me. The room grew quiet as she reached behind the tree and pulled out the bright pink plastic piggy bank. The cheap plastic gleamed under the opulent chandeliers. She walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, and shoved it into my hands. Her voice was loud, clear, and dripping with a venom disguised as maternal concern. "Since you are 35, single, and married to your spreadsheets, we figured you need to start saving for your lonely retirement," she announced. "You are not getting any younger, Jada, and all that money you hoard will not keep you warm at night." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by nervous chuckles from the relatives who knew better than to cross Valerie. I looked down at the hollow plastic pig. It felt weightless in my hands, a stark contrast to the millions of dollars in assets I managed for my clients every single day. The sheer audacity of her insult was breathtaking. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to remind everyone that despite my self-made success, I was fundamentally flawed in her eyes because I did not have a husband on my arm to validate my existence. I looked up from the piggy bank and met my mother's triumphant gaze. I did not flinch. I did not offer her the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply offered a polite, practiced smile and said, "Thank you, Mom." How incredibly thoughtful. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, clearly disappointed that I had not burst into tears or stormed out of the house. But the show had to go on. and my father was already stepping into the center of the room to reclaim the spotlight. Desmond clapped his hands together, his booming voice commanding the attention of every person in the room. He was a man who thrived on being the center of gravity, a master of grand gestures that hid his profound insecurities. "All right, everyone," he announced. "The night is not over yet. In fact, we have one final gift, a very special gift for a very special couple." He motioned for my younger sister, Kiara, and her husband, Connor, to step forward. Kiara was 29 years old, and the undeniable golden child of the family. She was everything my parents valued: superficial, compliant, and entirely dependent on their financial support to maintain her lifestyle. She had never held a job for more than 6 months, but she played the role of the perfect socialite daughter flawlessly. Beside her stood Connor. Connor was a mediocre, entitled white man who had married into what he mistakenly believed was an empire of endless black wealth. He contributed absolutely nothing to their household, but strutted around family events with an unearned superiority. He happily took my parents' money to fund his golf trips and designer watches while constantly making subtle, passive-aggressive jabs at my independence. He was deeply intimidated by a successful black woman he could neither impress nor control, and he used my single status as a weapon whenever he felt inadequate. My father pulled 2 silk blindfolds from his pocket. He tied one gently around Kiara's eyes and handed the other to Connor. The crowd murmured with anticipation as my father instructed everyone to grab their coats and follow them outside. The crisp winter air of Atlanta hit my face as I stepped onto the front porch. The driveway was bathed in the warm glow of the exterior floodlights. There, sitting directly in the center of the circular driveway, was a brand new, fully loaded midnight blue BMW X7. It was an absolute beast of a machine gleaming flawlessly in the night. On the hood sat a massive, ridiculous red velvet bow. My father guided Kiara and Connor to the front of the vehicle. On the count of 3, he instructed them to remove their blindfolds. 1, 2, 3. Kiara tore the silk from her eyes and let out an ear-piercing scream. She jumped up and down, throwing her arms around my father and sobbing with exaggerated joy. Connor pulled off his blindfold and let out a low whistle, shaking his head in mock disbelief. My mother stood nearby, wiping away a single fake tear as the extended family erupted into applause and cheers. Connor walked around the luxury SUV, running his hand over the pristine paint job. As he circled back toward the crowd, he intentionally bumped his shoulder against mine. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive bourbon, and whispered a racially tinged microaggression directly into my ear. "Some people just naturally attract blessings, Jada," he muttered with a smug grin, "while others just have to work themselves to death and still end up alone." I looked at him. I looked at this unremarkable man standing in a driveway he did not own, admiring a car he did not pay for, bought by a father-in-law who was drowning in debt. The delusion was almost poetic. Connor truly believed he had won the lottery of life. He thought he was untouchable, standing on a pedestal built entirely of lies and borrowed money. I simply smiled at him, adjusting the strap of my designer clutch. "You are absolutely right, Connor," I replied smoothly. "Some people definitely have to work for what they own." The family rushed forward to admire the vehicle. Champagne bottles were popped in the driveway. Kiara climbed into the driver's seat, posing for dozens of photos for her social media followers. My father handed her a valet key, making a grand speech about how his beautiful daughter deserved nothing but the absolute best in life. The celebration was loud, chaotic, and entirely focused on the spectacle of the moment. As the cold air began to bite, my mother suggested that everyone move to the heated backyard patio to continue the celebration around the fire pits. Slowly, the crowd migrated away from the driveway, leaving the gleaming midnight blue BMW sitting alone under the floodlights. I lingered behind, pretending to adjust my coat. The moment the front door closed and the sounds of laughter faded into the backyard, I opened my clutch. I reached inside and my fingers wrapped around the smooth, heavy plastic of a sleek electronic key fob, a master key fob that I had personally programmed 3 days ago. The night was perfectly still. I walked calmly toward the BMW. I did not rush. I did not sneak. I walked with the authority of someone who owned exactly what she was approaching. As I neared the driver's side door, I pressed the unlock button on the fob. The headlights flashed brilliantly in the dark, and the side mirrors folded outward with a soft mechanical hum. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of fresh premium leather enveloped me. The interior was immaculate, featuring ambient blue lighting that matched the exterior paint. I pressed my foot against the brake and pushed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a deep, powerful purr. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of my own calm expression. I placed the plastic dollar store piggy bank on the passenger seat right next to my clutch. I shifted the gear into drive. Without a single look back at the house, I eased the massive vehicle out of the circular driveway and merged onto the quiet suburban street. The digital clock on the dashboard read exactly 1 in the morning. The heated steering wheel warmed my hands as I navigated through the winding roads of their gated community. I drove past the security guard at the front entrance, giving him a polite wave as the heavy iron gates opened to let me out into the Atlanta night. I merged onto the highway, the smooth acceleration of the BMW pressing me back into the plush leather seat. 15 minutes passed in absolute peaceful silence. I enjoyed the feeling of the road, the quiet victory of my silent departure. Then, at exactly 1:15 in the morning, my phone screen lit up on the center console. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, the notification icon appeared, indicating a new voice message. I tapped the screen to play the audio through the car speakers. The sound of my father's unhinged screaming filled the pristine cabin of the vehicle. "Jada," his voice roared, echoing with panic and absolute fury. "Where is the car? Bring that car back right now, or I swear to God I am calling the police and reporting it stolen. You jealous, bitter little girl. You could not stand to see your sister happy. I will have you arrested, Jada. I will ruin your life. Bring it back right now." His voice cracked at the end, a beautiful mixture of rage and underlying terror. He hung up. I pulled the car onto the shoulder of the highway, placing it in park. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat, which included my parents, Kiara and Connor. I could see the little typing bubbles appearing and disappearing as they frantically panicked in the background. I typed my response slowly, ensuring every word was perfectly clear. I did not use capital letters to scream. I did not use exclamation points to convey emotion. I simply delivered the cold, hard facts that I had been holding on to all night. Go ahead and call the cops, Dad. Tell them to run the plates. And while you are at it, tell them to check the registration in the glove box. The car is in my name. I hit send. I watched the message deliver. I waited exactly 10 seconds to ensure they all had time to read it. Then I went into my settings and blocked every single one of their phone numbers. I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat next to the cheap pink piggy bank. I shifted the car back into drive, pulled onto the empty highway, and drove home in absolute perfect silence. The midnight air rushing past the sleek exterior of the X7 was the only sound keeping me company on the drive back to my townhouse. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling the raw power of the engine beneath me. It was a beautiful machine. But as I watched the Atlanta skyline glittering in the rearview mirror, I felt absolutely nothing for the car itself. To me, this vehicle was not a status symbol. It was a receipt. It was the physical manifestation of a toxic financial dynamic that had been poisoning my family for over a decade. Atlanta is a city that thrives on ambition, but it is also a city that can easily drown you in the illusion of success. My parents, Desmond and Valerie, fell in love with the illusion. They were absolutely obsessed with climbing to the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. They wanted the exclusive invitations, the charity gala photo ops, and the approving nods from the city elite. To get there, they constructed a flawless facade of generational wealth. But beneath the designer clothes and the extravagant holiday parties, they were quietly suffocating in a mountain of debt. Their entire existence was leased. The luxury sedans sitting in their driveway were swapped out every 3 years before the mileage penalties hit. The designer handbags my mother flaunted at Sunday service were purchased on credit cards with 24% interest rates. Their sprawling McMansion was a financial sinkhole. They had refinanced that house so many times, they effectively owned nothing but the front door. They borrowed money to pay off borrowed money, treating debt like a revolving line of income rather than a trap. They were playing a dangerous game of financial roulette, and for years I had front row seats to the disaster. As a corporate wealth manager, I live in the world of raw data. I spend my days analyzing risk, assessing asset allocation, and building sustainable wealth for clients who actually possess the capital my parents pretend to have. I know exactly what real wealth looks like. Real wealth is quiet. It is boring. It sits in diversified portfolios, commercial real estate, and index funds. It does not scream for attention on social media. Because I respect capital, I built my own net worth in absolute silence. While my parents were maxing out their credit limits to buy tables at prestigious galas, I was living in a modest apartment, pouring every spare dollar back into my firm. I drove a reliable sedan for 8 years. I wore tailored, unbranded suits. I prioritized acquiring commercial land over acquiring luxury labels. I understood early on that financial independence was the only real power a Black woman could wield in this world. My parents looked at my lifestyle and saw a lack of ambition. I looked at theirs and saw a ticking time bomb. The tension between us reached a breaking point when my business began to take off. The moment my firm landed its first major corporate client, my parents suddenly stopped viewing me as an embarrassment and started viewing me as an ATM. The requests for financial assistance started small. A utility bill they had supposedly forgotten. A sudden car repair. I paid them without asking questions out of a sense of filial duty, but the requests rapidly escalated. 3 years ago, my father sat me down in his home office, a room decorated with fake leather-bound books and a mahogany desk he bought on an installment plan. He poured me a glass of scotch and laid out his grand vision. He and my mother wanted to join one of the most exclusive country clubs in the metropolitan area. The initiation fee alone was staggering, not to mention the monthly dues and the mandatory spending minimums. He slid a brochure across the desk and told me that sponsoring their membership would be the perfect way for me to show my gratitude for everything they had done for me. I looked at the glossy brochure and then looked my father dead in the eye. I told him no. I explained clearly and firmly that funding a vanity project for social climbing did not align with my financial principles. I told him I would gladly help them consolidate their debt or hire a financial planner to fix their credit, but I would not underwrite their delusions of grandeur. That single word changed my role in the family forever. By saying no, I shattered the illusion they desperately needed to maintain. The narrative shifted overnight. I was no longer the hardworking daughter who built a company from scratch. In their eyes and in the stories they told our extended family, I became the villain. I was branded as stingy. I was labeled as selfish. My mother told her prayer circle that wealth had corrupted my soul. My father told his golfing buddies that I had forgotten where I came from. They weaponized my financial boundaries to cast me as a bitter, lonely woman who hoarded her money because she had no one to share it with. They needed me to be the villain because acknowledging my financial discipline would force them to confront their own financial recklessness. It was easier to call me selfish than to admit they were broke. This toxic dynamic became the bedrock of our family interactions. Every conversation became a passive-aggressive battleground. If I wore a nice watch, they made comments about how nice it must be to only have to worry about myself. If I declined to attend a lavish dinner they could not afford, they whispered about my lack of family loyalty. I endured their jabs in silence, refusing to take the bait. I kept my head down, focused on my clients, and watched my personal net worth climb while their credit scores plummeted. But nature abhors a vacuum. If I was going to be the family disappointment, they desperately needed a savior to balance the scales. They needed someone who would validate their chaotic lifestyle, someone who would prioritize appearances just as much as I prioritized reality. They needed a golden child to prove that their way of living was right and my way of living was wrong. That is exactly where my sister stepped into the spotlight, and why the midnight blue BMW I was currently driving became the ultimate weapon in their ongoing war against me. Kiara is 29 and practically floats through life on a cloud of my parents' subsidized delusions. She is undeniably beautiful, but it is a highly curated, expensive kind of beauty that requires a constant stream of cash to maintain. Hair extensions, designer bags, weekly spa appointments, and lavish vacations. She never pursued a serious career because she was never expected to. Her job was simply to exist as the perfect aesthetic accessory in my parents' carefully staged photographs. She was the compliant daughter, the one who never questioned the price tag as long as someone else was paying the bill. She validated their toxic financial habits by gleefully consuming whatever luxury they put on their overextended credit cards. 2 years ago, Kiara introduced the ultimate prop into their country club fantasy, her husband Connor. Connor is a remarkably average man who carries himself with the staggering confidence of someone who has never been told no. He is white, conventionally attractive in a very basic catalog model way, and utterly devoid of any actual ambition. When he first walked into my parents' Atlanta McMansion, you could practically see the dollar signs reflecting in his eyes. He looked at the marble floors, the imported chandeliers, and the luxury cars parked in the driveway and mistakenly believed he had married into a massive elite black dynasty. He thought he had secured a lifetime ticket to the easy life. What Connor did not realize was that he had married into a house of cards. But my parents were so desperate for the aesthetic of a successful blended family, a daughter married to a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a golf magazine, that they eagerly took on the financial burden of Connor. He contributes absolutely zero to their household. He calls himself an entrepreneur, but his business ventures are nothing more than vague concepts that require endless seed money from my father. He spends his days hitting the links networking at local clubs and wearing luxury watches that were financed on Desmond's already bleeding accounts. From the moment we met, Connor recognized me as a threat. Grifters always know when they are being audited, and Connor knew my eyes were scanning his ledger. He could not charm me. He could not intimidate me. And most importantly, he realized very quickly that I was the only person in the family who possessed the actual wealth he desperately wanted access to. Because he could not control me or impress me, he decided to tear me down. Connor perfected the art of the passive-aggressive strike. He realized early on that my parents resented my financial independence, so he weaponized it. At family dinners, he would lean back in his chair, swirling a glass of my father's expensive bourbon, and make snide remarks about my lifestyle. He would say things about how I was too aggressive for the dating market, or how corporate women lose their femininity when they spend too much time in the boardroom. He loved to highlight my single status, framing my independence as a tragic flaw, rather than a deliberate choice. He would wrap his arm around Kiara and boast about how a real man takes care of his wife, shooting pointed glances across the table at me. It was a pathetic defense mechanism. He was a mediocre man, entirely dependent on his black in-laws for his survival, and he was deeply intimidated by a self-made black woman who could buy and sell him before breakfast. It bruised his fragile ego to look across the dining table and see someone who did not need a man to secure a mortgage or build an empire. So he tried to diminish my worth by reducing my value to my marital status. If I did not have a husband, then in his mind my millions meant nothing. The worst part was not Connor himself. The worst part was that my parents encouraged his behavior. They laughed at his jokes and nodded along to his thinly veiled insults. They allowed this man who contributed nothing but audacity to their family to disrespect their eldest daughter in their own home. Connor became the attack dog they used to punish me for establishing boundaries. Whenever I refused to pay for a family vacation or co-sign a loan for one of his failed business ideas, Connor was there to remind everyone that my money could not buy me a family of my own. This toxic alliance between my desperate parents, the golden child sister, and her parasitic husband, created a unified front against me. They convinced themselves that because I refused to fund their charade, I deserved to be humiliated. They needed to prove that Kiara, the obedient, dependent daughter, was the true winner in life. They needed to show the world, and more importantly, show me that their way of living yielded the best rewards. And that twisted, resentful logic is exactly what led my father to hatch a plan so reckless, so phenomenally stupid, that it practically handed me the match to burn their entire facade to the ground. The financial drain did not happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical bleed disguised as familial obligation. As soon as my wealth management firm cleared its first million in assets under management, my parents decided my success was a communal resource. It started with emergencies. The roof needed replacing. The property taxes on the McMansion were suddenly reassessed and they were dangerously short. I paid the taxes because the thought of my parents losing their home terrified me. But my compliance only emboldened them. Soon the requests morphed from absolute necessities to blatant, absurd luxuries. My mother needed $10,000 to host a charity luncheon so she could secure her spot on the hospital auxiliary board. My father demanded a short-term loan to cover a bad investment he made with his country club buddies, promising he would pay me back the following week. The money never materialized. And then there was Kiara. Kiara required a continuous stream of cash to maintain the illusion that she and Connor were an Atlanta power couple. When Connor quit his third job in 2 years because he felt the work was beneath him, my parents demanded I cover their luxury apartment rent for 6 months. They told me it was my duty as the successful older sister to uplift my family. They heavily weaponized our culture against me, twisting the beautiful concept of community and shared success into a toxic guilt trip designed to empty my bank accounts. If I questioned the relentless spending, I was immediately accused of adopting a cold corporate mindset and forgetting the village that raised me. I was told I was acting superior and acting like I was better than the blood in my veins. 2 years ago, I finally audited my own life. I sat in my downtown office late one night pulling up the wire transfers, the cleared checks, and the credit card payments I had made on their behalf over a 5-year period. The total figure staring back at me on the spreadsheet was sickening. I had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into a black hole of vanity and entitlement. I realized I was not helping my family. I was enabling their financial suicide. The very next morning, I cut the cord. I called my parents and informed them the Bank of Jada was officially and permanently closed. I canceled the supplemental credit cards I had foolishly opened for emergencies. I stopped paying the property taxes on the house they could not afford. I refused to float Connor and Kiara another single dime. The fallout was apocalyptic. My father screamed through the phone that I was an ungrateful traitor who would end up miserable and alone. My mother cried hysterical tears and told me I was dead to her. Kiara sent me a scathing text message calling me a miserable, greedy spinster before blocking my number entirely. Overnight, I was completely excommunicated from the family narrative. I was no longer invited to Sunday dinners, holiday cookouts, or birthday celebrations. I was erased. They replaced me with Connor, treating him as the son they always wanted, simply because he played along with their wealthy facade. For 24 months, we existed in a state of absolute Cold War. I focused entirely on my firm expanding my client base and doubling my net worth. They focused on pretending I did not exist while sinking deeper into debt to maintain their lifestyle without my cash flow. So when the heavy embossed invitation to this year's Christmas Eve party arrived in my mailbox a month ago, I knew instantly it was a trap. My parents do not extend olive branches. They extend ambushes. They wanted me there tonight for one specific reason. They wanted to publicly humiliate me. They needed me to stand in that opulent living room surrounded by the Atlanta elite and witness them showering Kiara and Connor with an $80,000 luxury vehicle. It was a highly calculated theatrical display designed to break my spirit. They wanted to look me in the eye and say, "Look at what we can do without you. Look at how we can bless your sister while you stand there with nothing but a $1 plastic piggy bank." They wanted to prove that my financial discipline was meaningless and that their reckless entitlement was the true path to happiness. It was supposed to be the ultimate checkmate, a flawless public victory over the stingy daughter who dared to tell them no. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to feel jealous. They wanted me to crawl back to them, begging for a place in their glittering fake world. But my father made one fatal miscalculation in his desperate need to prove he did not need my money. He decided to steal my identity to get it. And that twisted, resentful logic is exactly how I ended up with the master key to that midnight blue BMW and why I am currently driving it down the highway, leaving their entire world to burn. Let us rewind the clock exactly 4 weeks. It was late November, right after a Thanksgiving dinner I was deliberately not invited to attend. I was sitting in my corner office in Midtown, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, wrapping up a quarterly portfolio review for a major corporate client. The office was quiet, the kind of pristine silence that only exists on a high floor after normal business hours. My phone buzzed on my mahogany desk. It was not a text message or a client email. It was an urgent push notification from my premium credit monitoring service. In my line of work, your credit score is your professional lifeblood. It dictates your leverage, your security, and your access to capital. I maintain an ironclad 820 credit score. I protect my financial identity with the exact same ruthless scrutiny I apply to my clients' offshore accounts and investment portfolios. So when the bright red banner flashed across my screen, warning me of a hard inquiry on my Equifax report, I did not just swipe it away. I opened the app immediately. The alert detailed a fresh, hard credit pull originating from an elite luxury auto dealership located right in the heart of Buckhead. The inquiry had been initiated less than 10 minutes prior. A cold prickle of realization slid down my spine. I had not stepped foot inside a car dealership in 8 years. My daily driver was perfectly fine, and I certainly was not in the market for a luxury vehicle. My identity had been compromised. But the physical location of the inquiry, Buckhead, a playground for Atlanta's image-obsessed elite, was a very specific detail. It reeked of my father's distinct brand of financial desperation. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not understand the law. I simply locked my computer, grabbed my designer trench coat, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive from Midtown to Buckhead took exactly 22 minutes. I spent that time in absolute silence, mentally preparing for the confrontation. If this was a random scammer, I would freeze my credit and file a police report without a second thought. But if this was Desmond, I needed to handle the situation with surgical precision. I needed to see the paperwork with my own eyes. The dealership was a massive glass and steel structure packed with high-end European imports. It was exactly the kind of place my father would frequent to stroke his fragile ego. The showroom floor gleamed under intense spotlighting, designed to make the expensive paint jobs sparkle. I walked through the sliding glass doors, projecting the kind of absolute, unbothered authority that makes people instinctively step out of your way. I bypassed the eager floor salesmen hovering near the entrance in their cheap suits. I did not have time to play games with commissioned hustlers looking for a quick sale. I marched straight to the polished marble reception desk. The young receptionist offered a rehearsed greeting, but I cut her off before she could finish her sentence. I stated my name and informed her that someone in her building had just run a fraudulent hard inquiry on my social security number. I demanded to speak to the finance director immediately. The receptionist blinked, her customer service smile faltering under my steady gaze. She tried to offer me a seat in the waiting lounge and a complimentary bottle of sparkling water. I leaned over the counter, lowering my voice to a dangerous calm. I told her that if the head of finance was not standing in front of me in the next 60 seconds, I would be calling the Atlanta Police Department to report an active case of felony identity theft on their premises. She picked up her phone with trembling hands. Less than a minute later, a man in a sharp, tailored suit hurried out of a glass-walled office. He wore a forced smile, attempting to de-escalate the situation with smooth corporate jargon. He asked me to step into his office so we could clear up what was surely a simple clerical error. I followed him into the glass enclosure, closing the heavy door firmly behind me. I did not sit down. I stood directly in front of his desk, pulled up the alert on my phone, and placed it flat on his immaculate desk pad. I pointed to the screen and informed him that a hard credit pull was executed under my social security number at this exact location 15 minutes ago. I stated clearly that I had not authorized this inquiry, and I demanded to see the application file immediately. The finance director tried to chuckle, brushing it off as a mix-up with a similarly named customer. He pulled up his database, typing rapidly on his keyboard. But as he read the screen, his forced smile vanished entirely. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on a live landmine. He stammered, asking me to verify my full name and date of birth. I rattled off my information, matching exactly what was displayed on his screen. He swallowed hard, nervously adjusting his collar. He told me that a credit application had indeed been submitted and approved for an $80,000 vehicle financing plan. I asked him who submitted it. He hesitated, citing customer privacy policies and dealership protocol. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on his desk, closing the distance between us. I reminded him that the application was in my name, using my credit history, which legally made me the customer. I told him that their dealership had just failed basic identity verification protocols. I explained that withholding the identity of the person who submitted the fraudulent application made him and his dealership accessories to wire fraud and felony identity theft. I pulled my phone back toward me and unlocked the screen, hovering my thumb over the keypad to dial the police. The immediate threat of criminal liability broke him completely. He turned his computer monitor around to face me. There, on the glowing screen, was a fully completed digital credit application for a midnight blue BMW X7. The applicant name was mine. The social security number was mine. The employment history and listed assets were mine, pulled directly from a set of outdated tax returns from 5 years ago when I foolishly helped my parents organize their chaotic finances for an audit. But the physical address listed on the application was my parents' heavily mortgaged McMansion, and the digital signature at the bottom of the document was a sloppy, desperate forgery of my name. My father, Desmond, had actually done it. He had walked into a luxury dealership, sweet-talked a salesman with his charismatic patriarch routine, claimed he was handling the paperwork for his busy executive daughter, and committed a federal crime just to buy a car for his golden child. He exploited my pristine credit because his own was entirely destroyed. He put $0 down on the vehicle, financing the entire $80,000 purchase purely on the strength of my financial reputation. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. My father thought I was just a bitter woman he could cast aside and steal from at his convenience. He thought he could outsmart me in the very arena where I made my living. The finance director watched me in terrified silence, waiting for me to start screaming or dial the authorities. But I did not scream. I looked at the approved financing terms and realized my father had just handed me the ultimate leverage on a silver platter. I looked up from the glowing monitor and met the terrified eyes of the finance director. He was sweating through his expensive cologne, fully expecting me to call the Atlanta Police Department and drag him out of his office in handcuffs. But arresting my father right then and there would have been entirely too easy. A quiet arrest sweeps the betrayal under the rug. It allows my parents to spin a narrative of a simple misunderstanding. I did not want a misunderstanding. I wanted an undeniable public execution of their fake empire. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I told the finance director to bring the general manager into this office right now. I made it clear that if he stalled or tried to call security, I would make sure this dealership made the evening news for facilitating felony identity theft. He scrambled out of his leather chair and practically sprinted down the hall. 3 minutes later, the general manager walked in. He was an older white man who looked like he spent more time on the golf course than on the showroom floor. He tried to offer me a patronizing smile, but it evaporated the second I laid out the facts. I told him his staff had just pushed through an $80,000 auto loan without properly verifying a government-issued ID against the applicant sitting in the chair. I pointed out that my father, Desmond, is a 60-year-old black man, and the social security number he used belongs to a 35-year-old black woman. I asked him how exactly his finance department managed to miss that glaring discrepancy, unless they were intentionally turning a blind eye to hit their end-of-month sales quotas. The general manager turned completely gray. He knew I had them dead to rights. A lawsuit for gross negligence and facilitation of wire fraud would not just cost him his job, it would cost the dealership its franchise license. He started stammering apologies, offering to cancel the loan, immediately shred the application, and flag my father's profile in their system. He promised to make the whole problem disappear. I held up my hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I told him I did not want the loan canceled. I wanted to assume it. Both men stared at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. I explained my terms with the cold precision of a corporate merger. The credit approval was legally tied to my social security number and my financial history. Therefore, under the law, I was the only authorized buyer in this room. I told them I was taking ownership of the transaction right now. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my corporate black card. I instructed the finance director to run a $15,000 charge as a cash down payment. I dictated my stipulations without leaving any room for negotiation. The title, the vehicle registration, and the insurance policy were to be drafted exclusively in my name. Jada. Not Desmond. Not Kiara. Just me. I wanted my father's name completely scrubbed from every single line of the ownership documents. The general manager nodded frantically, eager to comply and avoid a massive legal catastrophe. He personally typed up the amended purchase agreement, ensuring every box was checked according to my exact specifications. As the printer hummed in the corner, churning out the legitimate contracts, I moved to my next demand. I asked about the keys. The general manager explained that the BMW X7 came with 2 programmable master key fobs. I told him I was taking one of the master fobs with me right now. I instructed his service department to take the second key and program it with a restricted profile. I wanted it functioning essentially as a valet key, allowing the car to start and drive, but keeping the master control and tracking capabilities linked exclusively to my phone and my primary fob. The general manager handed me the sleek, heavy master key. I dropped it into my purse, letting the satisfying weight of it settle at the bottom. I signed the official purchase agreement, claiming my $80,000 property. Then I laid out the final phase of my strategy. My father had scheduled a VIP home delivery for the vehicle. He wanted the dealership to drive the car to his heavily mortgaged McMansion on Christmas Eve, complete with a massive red velvet bow on the hood, so he could surprise my sister in front of our entire extended family. The general manager asked if I wanted to cancel the delivery and simply drive the car off the lot today. I leaned across the desk and told him absolutely not. I instructed him to proceed with Desmond's requested delivery exactly as planned. I wanted them to polish that midnight blue exterior until it gleamed. I wanted them to put the biggest, most ridiculous red bow they had in their inventory right on the hood. I wanted their delivery driver to pull up to my parents' house at exactly 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve and hand that restricted valet key directly to my father. The 2 men exchanged bewildered looks, but they were in no position to argue. They agreed to follow my instructions to the letter. I gathered my receipts, my copy of the registration, and the official title paperwork. I slid the pristine manila folder into my briefcase. I thanked them for their exceptional customer service, turned on my heel, and walked out of the dealership. The drive back to my Midtown office was exhilarating. The trap was perfectly set. If I had stopped the purchase at the dealership, my father would have simply denied everything. He would have claimed it was a misunderstanding or a credit glitch. He would have played the victim and accused me of trying to sabotage his generous Christmas surprise. But by allowing the delivery to proceed, I was giving him enough rope to hang his entire fabricated empire. I needed him to take physical possession of the car. I needed him to stand in front of our aunts, uncles, and cousins and proudly claim he bought it. I needed him to hand that valet key to Kiara while Connor smirked at me from the sidelines. Because the moment he presented that vehicle as a gift, he was fully committing to the fraud. He was publicly locking himself into a felony. For the next 4 weeks, I went about my life with absolute business as usual. I managed my clients' portfolios, closed end-of-year deals, and attended holiday networking events. I ignored the passive-aggressive text messages from my mother reminding me to dress appropriately for their Christmas Eve party. I ignored the subtle jabs from Kiara in the family group chat about how excited she was for this year's gift exchange. They thought they were setting me up for the ultimate humiliation. They thought they were going to put me in my place and prove that my financial boundaries were meaningless against my father's ability to provide for his real family. Every time my phone buzzed with another toxic family message, I just looked at the sleek master key fob sitting on my desk. I let them build their anticipation. I let them construct their perfect Atlanta high society illusion. They were designing a flawless stage for their own destruction. They wanted an audience to witness my defeat, but they were actually gathering witnesses for their own unmasking. The final week before Christmas dragged by. My credit monitoring app confirmed the finalized auto loan, adjusting my available credit utilization. The insurance policy arrived in my email inbox confirming premium coverage on a vehicle I had not even sat in yet. Everything was legally airtight. Desmond had stolen my identity, but I had hijacked his theft and turned it into an ironclad asset. When the sun finally set on Christmas Eve, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my emerald green pantsuit. I slipped the registration folder into my briefcase and dropped the master key fob into my designer clutch. I was not walking into a family holiday party. I was walking into a repossession. I was stepping onto a battlefield armed with irrefutable facts and legally binding documents. They wanted to show me that I was a bitter, lonely woman who had nothing but spreadsheets. I was about to show them exactly how dangerous a woman with spreadsheets can be. The sun rose over Atlanta, crisp and unforgiving on Christmas morning. The digital clock on my espresso machine read exactly 9 o'clock. I was standing in the immaculate kitchen of my private gated townhouse, sipping a freshly brewed dark roast. In my attached two-car garage, the midnight blue BMW sat parked perfectly adjacent to my practical daily driver. The house was blissfully quiet. My phone remained entirely silent since I had permanently blocked my entire toxic bloodline the night before. I was completely at peace, enjoying the first stress-free holiday I had experienced in over a decade. Then the security intercom mounted on my kitchen wall chimed. It was the head guard for my private community. His voice was incredibly tense over the speaker. He informed me that my parents, my sister and her husband, were parked at the front gate and causing a massive disturbance. They were not alone. They had brought 2 officers from the Atlanta Police Department and were demanding immediate access to my property, claiming I had stolen a luxury vehicle. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. I simply set down my coffee mug. I instructed the security guard to open the heavy iron gates. I told him to let the police cruiser through and to allow my father's leased vehicle to follow them directly to my driveway. I wanted this confrontation to happen on my territory. I wanted to drag their dirty secrets into the broad daylight of my affluent neighborhood. I wanted my neighbors to witness the exact moment my family's grand illusion of superiority collapsed under the crushing weight of federal law. I walked into my home office and picked up the 2 pristine manila folders I had prepared weeks in advance. I did not bother getting dressed in street clothes. I remained in my heavy silk robe, tying the sash securely around my waist. I slid my bare feet into my slippers, picked up my coffee mug, and walked out to my front porch. I leaned against one of the structural columns and waited for the show to begin. A minute later, an Atlanta Police Department cruiser pulled into my driveway, followed closely by my father's silver Mercedes. Before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, the doors of the Mercedes flew open. Connor was the first one out. My white brother-in-law stormed up my walkway, acting as if he owned the concrete beneath his feet. My father Desmond was right behind him, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. My mother Valerie and my sister Kiara trailed behind, clinging to each other and putting on a spectacular theatrical performance of devastated victimhood. Connor immediately approached the 2 officers who were stepping out of their cruiser. He did not let my father speak. Connor loved to position himself as the savior of the black family he had married into, especially when it came to dealing with law enforcement. He aggressively pointed his finger at me as I stood calmly on my porch. "Officers, you need to arrest her right now," Connor barked, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "She is completely unhinged. She had a massive mental breakdown at our family Christmas party last night and stole my wife's brand new $80,000 car out of pure jealousy. She is aggressive and mentally unstable. She poses a threat to herself and others. He intentionally used every racially coded microaggression in the book. He wanted the officers to see me as an angry, volatile black woman who had snapped. He thought his whiteness and his loud, unearned confidence would automatically align the police with his fabricated narrative. He wanted them to rush my porch and put me in handcuffs before I could even speak. Valerie wailed on cue, covering her face with her hands. She cried out about how she had failed as a mother, how I had always been the bitter, jealous daughter who could not stand to see her younger sister happy. Kiara leaned against her husband, sobbing dramatically about how her beautiful Christmas morning was ruined. Desmond puffed out his chest, attempting to project the image of a wealthy, distinguished patriarch dealing with a wayward child. The two officers walked up my driveway, keeping a cautious distance. The lead officer, a tall, stern-looking man, held up his hand to silence Connor's shouting. He looked at me sipping my coffee in my silk robe. I did not look unstable. I looked like a wealthy homeowner annoyed by a minor inconvenience. "Ma'am," the officer said, maintaining a professional tone, "we received a report of a stolen midnight blue BMW X7 taken from a residence across town last night. These individuals claim you are in possession of the vehicle. Is the car on this property?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. I lowered the mug and smiled pleasantly at the officer. "Yes, officer," I replied smoothly. "The vehicle is parked securely in my garage. Would you like to inspect it?" Connor let out a triumphant bark of laughter. "She just confessed," he yelled, turning to the second officer. "She just admitted she took it. Go put the cuffs on her." I ignored Connor, completely treating him like a buzzing insect. I reached over and pressed the keypad mounted on the exterior wall of my house. The heavy double doors of my garage slowly rolled upward, revealing the magnificent midnight blue BMW resting exactly where I had parked it hours ago. The officers stepped closer to the garage, pulling out their notepads. Before they could ask another question, I walked down the porch steps and handed the lead officer the first pristine manila folder. "I understand these people are highly emotional, officer," I said, my voice echoing the cool detachment of a corporate boardroom. "But I highly suggest you review the contents of that folder before anyone else raises their voice on my property." The officer opened the folder. Inside was the original state-issued vehicle title, the dealership purchase agreement, the proof of premium insurance, and my Georgia driver license. Every single document was flawless. Every single document was printed exclusively with my name, Jada. The officer studied the paperwork carefully, comparing the dealership VIN to the vehicle parked in my garage. He pulled out his radio and contacted dispatch, asking them to run the license plates and verify the registration details. For 2 excruciating minutes, my family stood in the driveway, glaring at me with absolute hatred. Connor crossed his arms over his chest, completely convinced that I had somehow forged the paperwork and was about to be arrested for a secondary crime. Desmond glared at me, trying to silently intimidate me into submission. Then the radio on those officers' shoulder crackled to life. Dispatch confirmed that the vehicle was legally registered, insured, and titled to me. There were no liens attached to any other individual. The car belonged entirely to the woman standing in the driveway. The lead officer closed the folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to face Connor and my father. His professional demeanor instantly shifted from investigative to highly suspicious. "Sir," the officer said, addressing my father directly, "this vehicle is legally registered to the homeowner. You cannot report a car stolen when the legal owner is the one driving it." Connor lost his mind. He lunged forward, his face turning beet red. "That is impossible!" Connor screamed, pointing wildly at the BMW. "Desmond bought that car. He financed it yesterday. We literally watched him sign the delivery papers. She is lying. She manipulated the system. Arrest her." I did not let the officer respond. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and my family. The cold morning air felt incredible against my skin. I looked at Desmond, watching the color drain entirely from his face. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew his house of cards was collapsing in real time. My father is currently experiencing a severe financial crisis. I told the officers, projecting my voice, so every neighbor standing by their windows could hear me. His credit is entirely destroyed. He cannot even qualify for a store credit card, let alone an $80,000 luxury auto loan. So yesterday morning, he decided to commit felony identity theft to secure the financing for that vehicle. I handed the lead officer the second manila folder. Inside that file, you will find a copy of the forged credit application my father submitted to the Buckhead dealership, I explained methodically. You will also find a certified printout from my credit monitoring service showing the unauthorized hard inquiry on my social security number. Most importantly, you will find a signed and notarized affidavit from the dealership general manager. The affidavit confirms that Desmond presented my outdated tax returns, forged my signature on the financing documents, and attempted to illegally secure a vehicle using my financial identity. The officers opened the second folder. They read the affidavit. The gravity of the situation shifted the entire atmosphere in the driveway. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a borrowed car. This was a documented open and shut case of federal wire fraud and felony identity theft. Connor suddenly went dead silent. The aggressive, arrogant savior complex evaporated instantly. He took a massive step away from my father, realizing that he had just aggressively demanded the police investigate a situation that directly implicated his father-in-law in a major felony. Kiara stopped her theatrical crying. She stared at Desmond, her mouth hanging open in shock. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her carefully constructed high society persona shattered into a million pieces. She realized that her husband was about to be arrested in the middle of an affluent neighborhood in broad daylight. She threw herself toward the officers, grabbing at their uniform sleeves. "You cannot do this!" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "It is a misunderstanding. It is a family matter. Family does not send family to jail. Jada, please tell them it is a joke. Tell them to stop." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely zero pity. "Family does not steal from family, Mom," I said coldly. "Family does not exploit their daughter's credit to buy a luxury prop for a man who contributes nothing to society. You wanted to humiliate me last night. You wanted to show me that I was nothing but a lonely spinster with a plastic piggy bank. Well, this is my return gift to you. Accountability." I turned my attention back to the lead officer. "I wish to press full charges for identity theft fraud and filing a false police report," I stated firmly. The officers did not hesitate. The evidence was irrefutable, and my father had practically delivered himself into their custody. The lead officer instructed Desmond to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in my driveway was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 10 years. Desmond did not fight back. His massive ego had been completely hollowed out. He kept his head down, staring at the concrete as the officers read him his Miranda rights. Valerie collapsed onto the manicured grass of my front lawn, sobbing uncontrollably as her husband was marched toward the back of the police cruiser. Connor grabbed Kiara by the arm, violently pulling her toward their leased Mercedes. He did not look back. He did not offer to help my mother off the grass. The coward was purely focused on escaping before the officers decided to ask him what he knew about the fraudulent paperwork. He shoved his wife into the passenger seat, got behind the wheel, and sped out of my driveway, leaving my mother weeping on the ground. I watched the police cruiser back out of my property, carrying the patriarch of the family away in disgrace. I walked over to where my mother was kneeling on the cold grass. I looked down at her ruined designer coat and her tear-streaked makeup. I did not offer her my hand. I simply told her she had exactly 1 minute to get off my property before I called security to have her removed for trespassing. She scrambled to her feet and ran down the street, sobbing as she tried to call a rideshare. I turned around, walked back into my warm house, locked the door, and finally drank my coffee. For exactly 1 week, the silence from my family was absolute. It was the frantic, terrified silence of rodents scurrying under the floorboards after the kitchen lights are abruptly turned on. Desmond spent exactly 48 hours in the Fulton County Jail, before my mother managed to scrape together enough cash from a predatory bail bondsman to secure his release. The felony charges for identity theft and wire fraud were pending trial, and the district attorney had absolutely no intention of dropping the case. The evidence I provided was too pristine, too legally binding for them to ignore. My father was facing serious federal time, and my mother was facing the ultimate collapse of her fake high society empire. But narcissists do not retreat when they are exposed. They double down. Fast forward to New Year Eve. Instead of laying low and contacting a defense attorney, my parents decided the best way to handle a looming felony conviction was to throw the most extravagant party of the year. Kiara and Connor were the official hosts of a massive, heavily publicized New Year Eve gala at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. The logic behind this absurd financial decision was painfully transparent. They needed to control the narrative. The rumors of my father being escorted out of my driveway in handcuffs had already started to circulate among the Buckhead elite. My parents needed to prove that they were still untouchable, that the arrest was nothing more than a clerical error or a bizarre misunderstanding. More importantly, they needed a scapegoat, and that scapegoat was me. Through my network of clients and social connections, I heard exactly what story they were spinning to the country club crowd. They were telling everyone that I had suffered a severe jealous mental breakdown. They claimed that I was bitterly single and so envious of Kiara and Connor's perfect marriage that I had maliciously manipulated some banking documents to steal my sister's Christmas gift. They painted Desmond as the victim of a ruthless, ungrateful daughter who had lost her mind. Connor was apparently holding court at local bars, telling anyone who would listen that I was a lonely corporate fraud who needed psychiatric help, and that they had officially cut me off from the family for my own good. They thought I would hide in my townhouse out of shame. They assumed I would be too embarrassed by their public smear campaign to ever show my face in their circles again. They vastly underestimated my threshold for confrontation. If they wanted to use a high society gala to rewrite reality, I was going to use that exact same gala to deliver the final killing blow. I did not just sit at home during that week between Christmas and New Year Eve. I weaponized every single resource at my disposal. As a corporate wealth manager, I have access to top-tier forensic accountants and private investigators. I knew my father's business had been hemorrhaging money for years, but I also knew he had recently taken out a massive commercial loan to supposedly restructure his operations. I hired a team to look into where that capital actually went. What they uncovered was so spectacularly damning, it almost made me laugh. The money had not gone into my father's business. It had been systematically siphoned out through a series of shell companies controlled by none other than Connor. My useless, arrogant brother-in-law had not been consulting for my father. He had been embezzling. The forensic audit proved that Connor was pulling cash out of the family business to pay off massive illegal sports gambling debts. He was drowning in liabilities to offshore bookies, and he was using my father's failing company as his personal piggy bank. My parents were completely oblivious. They were funding Connor's affluent lifestyle and his crippling gambling addiction, all while he smiled in their faces and insulted me at their dinner table. I printed the entire forensic audit. I placed it in a sleek leather portfolio. I also obtained a certified copy of the country club's internal ledger. I knew the general manager of the club through one of my corporate clients, and I knew for a fact that Desmond and Valerie were exactly $30,000 behind on their membership dues. They had leased the ballroom for the New Year Eve gala on a promise of future payment. The stage was perfectly set. On New Year Eve, I did not dress to blend in. I dressed for a funeral. Their funeral. I wore a custom-tailored floor-length crimson designer gown that hugged every curve perfectly. The color was bold, unapologetic, and entirely lethal. I paired it with diamond drop earrings and a classic red lip. I looked like a woman who managed millions of dollars before breakfast. I looked like a woman who held the executioner's axe. At 11:15 at night, just as the gala was reaching its absolute peak, I pulled up to the grand entrance of the country club. I did not arrive in an Uber. I did not drive my practical daily sedan. I arrived in the exact same midnight blue $80,000 BMW X7 my father had committed a felony to buy. The valet rushed forward to open my door, his eyes widening at the immaculate vehicle. I stepped out of the BMW, handing him the key with a crisp $20 bill. "Keep it parked right up front," I instructed him, my voice smooth and calm. "I will not be staying long." I walked up the grand sweeping staircase to the main ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors were propped open, and the sound of a live jazz band spilled out into the lobby. The room was dripping in forced elegance. Ice sculptures, champagne fountains, and hundreds of Atlanta's most wealthy and influential residents dressed in their finest tuxedos and evening gowns. I did not hesitate. I walked straight past the welcome table, ignoring the frantic whispers of the event staff who recognized me. I strode directly into the center of the ballroom, heading straight for the VIP section, where my family had cordoned themselves off behind velvet ropes. The crowd parted for me instinctively. When you walk with absolute unbothered authority, people move. I felt the eyes of every investor, socialite, and gossiping neighbor lock onto my crimson gown. The whispers started immediately, spreading across the room like wildfire. My mother Valerie was the first to see me. She was standing next to an ice sculpture, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke some local politician had just made. The laughter died in her throat the second she made eye contact with me. Her face went ashen, and the champagne flute in her hand trembled visibly. Kiara and Connor were sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the VIP area, surrounded by a group of young, affluent investors Connor was desperately trying to court. Kiara looked up, saw me, and immediately grabbed her husband's arm in a blind panic. Connor stood up, his face flushing with a mix of cheap bourbon and pure defensive rage. He actually thought he still had the upper hand. He thought he could bully me out of the room before I could speak. He marched up to the velvet rope blocking my path. "What the hell are you doing here, Jada?" Connor demanded, his voice loud enough to silence the jazz band playing nearby. "You are not welcome here. Security! Get security over here right now. My unstable sister-in-law is trespassing." He puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me, looming over me with his mediocre height. "You need to leave before you embarrass yourself further," he hissed, leaning in close. "You are a bitter, lonely fraud, and nobody here wants to deal with your pathetic mental breakdowns. Go back to your spreadsheets." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at the panicked faces of the investors sitting behind him. I looked at my mother, who looked like she was about to faint. I looked at my father, who was currently out on bail, standing frozen near the bar. "I am not here to embarrass myself, Connor," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, cold and echoing clearly across the sudden dead silence of the ballroom. "I am here to deliver some highly sensitive financial documents, and since you have decided to conduct your business in public, I figured this was the perfect venue for a performance review." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the leather portfolio. The entire room was holding its collective breath, watching the drama unfold. This was the moment their entire Atlanta high society facade shattered into absolute irreparable dust. Connor slammed the passenger door of my father's silver Mercedes with enough force to rattle the windows of my quiet, gated community. He marched up the center of my driveway, acting as if he owned the concrete beneath his feet. He did not wait for my parents to follow him, and he certainly did not wait for the 2 Atlanta Police Department officers to fully exit their patrol car. He intercepted them immediately, desperate to control the narrative and position himself as the righteous savior of his victimized in-laws. "Officers, you need to arrest her right now," Connor barked, his voice echoing aggressively off the brick facades of the neighboring townhouses. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me. I was standing on my front porch, wrapped in my heavy silk robe, holding a mug of dark roast coffee. The crisp winter air felt incredibly refreshing. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there, letting the steam rise from my mug, watching a mediocre man unravel. Connor leaned towards the officers, invading their personal space with unearned, arrogant confidence. He launched into a frantic, heavily rehearsed monologue designed to assassinate my character before I could speak a single word in my own defense. "She is completely unhinged," he insisted, raising his voice so the neighbors peeking through their plantation blinds could hear every single syllable. She had a massive mental breakdown at our family Christmas party last night and stole my wife's brand new $80,000 car out of pure spite. She is aggressive. She is irrational. She poses a legitimate threat to herself and others. It was a masterclass in weaponized vocabulary. Aggressive, irrational, unhinged, threat. Connor was intentionally using racially coded language, hoping to trigger a specific hostile response from law enforcement against a successful Black woman. He wanted the police to view me as a volatile danger rather than a wealthy property owner standing peacefully on her own front porch. He wanted them to bypass standard protocol, draw their weapons, and put me in handcuffs purely on the strength of his loud white indignation. He was betting everything on the assumption that his shouted accusations carried more weight than my silent existence. While Connor was busy shouting instructions at the police, my mother Valerie initiated her own theatrical performance. She collapsed heavily against the side of the Mercedes, clutching her chest and sobbing perfectly on cue. She was playing the devastated, victimized matriarch to absolute perfection. "I do not know what happened to my eldest daughter," she wailed, ensuring her trembling voice carried across the manicured lawn. "We tried to give her a beautiful Christmas, and she just snapped. She has always been so fiercely jealous of her younger sister. She simply could not stand to see Kiara happy." Kiara stood next to her, wiping away non-existent tears, playing the tragic bride whose perfect holiday had been maliciously ruined. My father Desmond stood in the background with his arms crossed, trying to look like a stern, disappointed patriarch. But I could see the nervous sweat gathering along his hairline despite the December chill. He knew exactly what he did at that Buckhead dealership. He was silently praying that Connor's loud intimidation tactics would bully me into handing over the keys before the police started asking for official paperwork. The lead officer, a seasoned veteran with graying temples, held up a gloved hand, forcing Connor to step back. The officer was clearly not impressed by the shouting or the theatrics. He assessed the situation, taking in Connor's frantic, manic energy, Valerie's performative sobbing, and then turning his sharp gaze directly to me. I was the absolute picture of tranquility. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I was not frantic. I was not defensive. I did not shout over them to offer explanations or defend myself against Connor's ridiculous fabricated accusations. I simply waited for the officer to approach my porch. The stark contrast between my icy, unbothered composure and my family's chaotic desperation was striking, and the officer immediately picked up on the discrepancy. He walked up my driveway, keeping a professional distance, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. "Ma'am," the officer said, maintaining a calm and authoritative tone. "We received a report of a stolen midnight blue BMW taken from a residence across town early this morning. These individuals claim you took the vehicle out of spite, and that it is currently hidden on this property. Can you tell me what is going on here?" Connor could not help himself. He shouted from the bottom of the driveway, interrupting the police. "She just confessed to us last night over text message. She is a bitter, lonely fraud, and she took the car because she has nothing else in her miserable life. Stop talking to her and arrest her right now." The officer did not even look back at Connor. He kept his eyes locked on me, waiting for my response. I lowered my coffee mug. "Good morning, officer," I replied, my tone perfectly modulated, echoing the polite but firm authority of a corporate boardroom. "I understand these people are highly emotional right now, but no vehicle was stolen. The car they are referring to is parked securely inside my garage. I would be more than happy to let you inspect it." I reached over and pressed the security keypad mounted on the exterior brick wall of my house. The heavy double doors of my garage slowly rolled upward with a smooth mechanical hum. The morning sun caught the pristine metallic paint of the midnight blue BMW X7, resting exactly where I had parked it hours ago. Connor let out a loud, triumphant bark of laughter. "See," he yelled, slapping the hood of the Mercedes. "I told you she took it. It is right there. Go put the cuffs on her." I ignored Connor entirely, treating him like irrelevant background noise. I set my coffee mug down on the small patio table beside me. I picked up the pristine manila folder I had prepared weeks in advance. I walked down the front steps, my silk robe flowing behind me, and approached the lead officer. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I simply handed him the folder. Before anyone else raises their voice on my property, I highly suggest you review the contents of that folder, I stated, clearly maintaining unwavering eye contact with the officer. Because the individuals standing at the bottom of my driveway are currently attempting to use your department to facilitate a massive crime. The officer took the folder. He opened it carefully, flipping through the stack of meticulously organized documents. I watched his eyes scan the paperwork. I knew exactly what he was reading. The first document was the original state-issued vehicle title, completely clean and unencumbered. The second document was the official dealership purchase agreement, detailing the $80,000 transaction and the $15,000 cash down payment. The third document was the premium auto insurance policy, bound and active as of yesterday afternoon. The fourth document was a color photocopy of my Georgia driver license. Every single document was flawless. Every single document was legally binding. And every single document was printed exclusively with my name. Jada. There was no mention of Desmond. There was no mention of Kiara. There was certainly no mention of Connor. The entire paper trail led directly to the woman standing calmly in front of him. The officer studied the paperwork for a long moment, his brow furrowing as he compared the dealership vehicle identification number to the plates on the car sitting in my garage. The silence in the driveway stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. Connor's triumphant smirk slowly began to falter as he realized the police were not rushing forward to tackle me to the ground. Valerie's fake sobbing tapered off into anxious, shallow hiccups. My father shifted his weight from foot to foot, the reality of his massive miscalculation finally crashing down on him. He thought his forged signature at the dealership was a stroke of absolute genius. He thought he had outsmarted his successful daughter and secured a free luxury vehicle to maintain his fake high society facade. He never anticipated that I would weaponize the very system he tried to exploit. I stood in the cold morning air, watching the officer process the undeniable truth held in his hands. I had laid the groundwork perfectly. The trap had snapped shut and my entire family was standing blindly inside it. The lead officer did not hand the folder back to me immediately. Instead, he unclipped the radio from his shoulder and stepped away from the group. He pressed the transmission button, requesting a direct verification from dispatch. His voice was steady and professional as he read off the vehicle identification number from the dealership paperwork I had provided. Then he walked over to the open garage and read the license plate on the back of the midnight blue BMW. The entire driveway fell into a suffocating silence. The only sound was the low hum of the police cruiser engine and the distant chirp of winter birds. Connor shifted his weight impatiently, glaring at me as if his sheer white entitlement could somehow alter federal financial records. My father Desmond stared at the concrete, his polished leather shoes suddenly looking very heavy. He was sweating despite the freezing December air. He knew what dispatch was going to say. The radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice echoed loudly in the crisp morning air. The vehicle was confirmed as legally registered, insured, and titled exclusively to me. There were no active liens from Desmond. There was absolutely no stolen vehicle report on file that superseded my legal ownership. The lead officer clipped his radio back onto his uniform. He closed the manila folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. Then he turned his attention entirely to the group standing at the bottom of my driveway. His demeanor had completely transformed. He was no longer investigating a theft. He was now dealing with individuals who had just filed a false police report and wasted city resources on a holiday morning. "Sir," the officer said, addressing my father with a sharp, authoritative tone, "Dispatch just confirmed everything in this folder. That vehicle legally belongs to the homeowner. You cannot call the police and report a car stolen when the legal buyer is the one parked in her own garage." Connor lost his mind. His fragile ego simply could not process the fact that a black woman had outmaneuvered him and his fabricated narrative. He stepped forward, pointing aggressively at the garage. "That is impossible," Connor shouted, his face flushing an ugly shade of crimson. "You are not looking at the right paperwork. Desmond bought that car yesterday. We literally watched him sign the delivery documents. She is lying to you. She manipulated the system. Arrest her right now." The officer placed his hand firmly on his duty belt, taking a deliberate step toward Connor. "I strongly suggest you lower your voice and step back, sir," the officer warned. "You do not dictate who gets arrested on this property." My father tried to salvage the unsalvageable. He stepped in front of Connor, attempting to project his usual charming, distinguished patriarch persona. But his voice cracked, betraying his absolute terror. "Officer, there has to be a mistake," Desmond stammered, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "My daughter is a wealth manager. She has access to banking networks. She must have hacked the dealership database and altered the title overnight. I am the one who secured the financing." I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for all morning. I walked down the front steps, my silk robe flowing behind me, and approached the officers. "There is no mistake, officer," I stated, my voice cutting through the cold air like a razor. "But my father is partially correct. He did attempt to secure the financing for that vehicle yesterday. The problem is, he used my social security number to do it." I handed the lead officer the second pristine manila folder. "I understand you were called here for a stolen vehicle." I continued, speaking clearly, so my neighbors standing on their porches could hear every single word. "But what you have actually walked into is an active crime scene for federal wire fraud. Inside that folder, you will find a copy of the fraudulent credit application submitted to the Buckhead Luxury Auto Dealership. My father, Desmond, used my outdated tax returns and forged my digital signature to secure an $80,000 auto loan because his own credit is entirely destroyed." The officers opened the second folder. Right behind that forged application, I added smoothly, "You will find a signed and notarized affidavit from the general manager of the dealership. The affidavit explicitly confirms that the man standing in my driveway presented my financial documents and illegally attempted to secure a vehicle using my identity. I intercepted the transaction, paid the down payment in cash, and legally assumed the title to protect my own credit. He called you here today to help him steal the car back." The officers read the affidavit. The gravity of the situation hit them immediately. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a borrowed Christmas gift. This was a documented open and shut case of felony identity theft. Connor suddenly went completely silent. The aggressive, arrogant savior complex evaporated in a matter of seconds. He took a massive step backward, putting physical distance between himself and my father. Connor was a grifter, and grifters always know when the mark is busted. He realized that he had just aggressively demanded the police investigate a situation that directly implicated his father-in-law in a major felony. If he kept talking, he was going to end up in handcuffs right next to him as an accessory. Kiara stared at our father, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The pristine image of her wealthy provider had just been shattered into a million pieces. Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her carefully constructed high society persona completely imploded. She realized her husband was about to be arrested in the middle of an affluent neighborhood in broad daylight. She threw herself toward the officers, grabbing frantically at their uniform sleeves. "You cannot do this," Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "It is a misunderstanding. It is a family matter. We are a good family. Family does not send family to jail. Jada, please tell them it is a joke. Tell them to stop." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely zero pity. "Family does not steal from family, Mom," I said coldly. "Family does not exploit their daughter's credit to buy a luxury prop for a man who contributes nothing to society. You wanted to humiliate me last night. You wanted to show me that I was nothing but a lonely woman with a plastic piggy bank. Well, this is my return gift to you. Accountability." I turned my attention back to the lead officer, looking him dead in the eye. "I wish to press full charges for identity theft, wire fraud, and filing a false police report," I stated firmly. The officers did not hesitate. The evidence was irrefutable, and my father had practically delivered himself into their custody. The lead officer stepped around Valerie and instructed Desmond to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Desmond did not fight back. His massive ego had been completely hollowed out. He kept his head down, staring at the concrete driveway as the officer pulled his arms backward. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the crisp winter air was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 10 years. The second officer stood by reciting the Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Valerie collapsed onto the manicured grass of my front lawn, sobbing uncontrollably as her husband was marched toward the back of the police cruiser. She wailed, begging the neighbors not to look, but they were already recording the entire spectacle on their cell phones. Connor proved exactly what kind of man he was. He grabbed Kiara by the arm, violently pulling her toward their leased Mercedes. He did not look back. He did not offer to help my mother off the frozen grass. The coward was purely focused on escaping before the officers decided to ask him what he knew about the fraudulent paperwork. He shoved his crying wife into the passenger seat, got behind the wheel, and sped out of my driveway, leaving my mother weeping on the ground alone. I watched the police cruiser back out of my property, carrying the patriarch of the family away in disgrace. I walked over to where my mother was kneeling on the cold grass. I looked down at her ruined designer coat and her tear-streaked makeup. I did not offer her my hand. I simply told her she had exactly 1 minute to get off my property before I called security to have her removed for trespassing. She scrambled to her feet and ran down the street sobbing as she tried to order a ride on her phone. I turned around, walked back into my warm house, locked the heavy wooden door, and finally finished my coffee. My father spent exactly 48 hours in the Fulton County Jail. He sat in a cold holding cell while my mother frantically scrambled to secure his release. Because their credit was completely destroyed and their assets were leveraged to the absolute limit, they could not simply post bail through traditional channels. My mother had to scrape together cash by quietly selling off her designer handbags and securing a predatory high-interest loan from a local bail bondsman just to get her husband back into the suburbs. The felony charges for identity theft and wire fraud were officially pending trial. The district attorney had absolutely no intention of dropping the case. The evidence I provided on Christmas morning, the forged credit application, the dealership affidavit, the matching IP addresses, was too pristine and too legally binding for them to ignore. My father was facing serious federal time, and my mother was facing the ultimate unavoidable collapse of her fake high society empire. But narcissists do not retreat when they are exposed. They double down. Fast forward to New Year Eve. Instead of laying low, hiring a competent criminal defense attorney and preparing for trial, my parents decided the best way to handle a looming felony conviction was to throw the most extravagant party of the year. Kiara and Connor were named as the official hosts of a massive, heavily publicized New Year Eve gala at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta. The logic behind this absurd financial decision was painfully transparent. They needed to aggressively control the narrative. The rumors of my father being escorted out of my driveway in handcuffs had already started to circulate among the Buckhead elite. My parents needed to prove that they were still untouchable, that the arrest was nothing more than a clerical error or a bizarre misunderstanding engineered by a disgruntled employee. More importantly, they needed a scapegoat, and that scapegoat was me. Through my network of corporate clients and elite social connections, I heard exactly what story my family was spinning to the country club crowd. They were actively executing a vicious, calculated smear campaign against me. They told everyone who would listen that I had suffered a severe, jealous mental breakdown. They claimed that I was bitterly single, overwhelmingly envious of Kiara and Connor's perfect marriage, and that my isolation had finally driven me to madness. According to their fabricated narrative, I had maliciously manipulated banking documents to steal my sister's Christmas gift out of pure spite. They painted Desmond as the tragic victim of a ruthless, ungrateful daughter who had lost her mind. Connor was apparently holding court at local bars and golf courses, telling anyone who would buy him a drink that I was a lonely corporate fraud who needed intense psychiatric help. He told his networking contacts that the family had officially cut me off for their own safety. They thought I would hide in my townhouse out of shame. They assumed I would be too embarrassed by their public assassination of my character to ever show my face in their circles again. They vastly underestimated my threshold for confrontation. If they wanted to use a high society gala to rewrite reality, I was going to use that exact same gala to deliver the final killing blow. I did not just sit at home during that week between Christmas and New Year Eve, crying over their betrayal. I weaponized every single resource at my disposal. As a corporate wealth manager, I have access to top-tier forensic accountants and elite private investigators. I knew my father's business had been hemorrhaging money for years, but I also knew he had recently taken out a massive commercial loan to supposedly restructure his operations. I hired a specialized team to look into where that capital actually went. I wanted to know exactly what kind of financial ruin my father was trying to hide beneath his tailored suits. What my forensic team uncovered was so spectacularly damning it almost made me laugh out loud in my office. The commercial loan money had not gone into my father's business. It had not been used to pay vendors or secure new inventory. It had been systematically siphoned out through a series of shell companies controlled by none other than Connor. My useless, arrogant brother-in-law had not been consulting for my father as he claimed to the family. He had been actively embezzling. The forensic audit proved with devastating clarity that Connor was pulling cash out of the family business to pay off massive illegal sports gambling debts. Connor was drowning in severe liabilities to offshore bookies. He was using my father's failing company as his personal piggy bank, draining the last remaining drops of capital my parents possessed. My parents were completely oblivious to the theft. They were happily funding Connor's affluent lifestyle and his crippling gambling addiction, all while he smiled in their faces, praised their generosity, and insulted me at their dinner table. He was a parasite feeding on a dying host. I printed the entire forensic audit on premium corporate stationery. I placed it in a sleek leather portfolio. I wanted the paper trail to be heavy enough to feel significant when I handed it over. But I did not stop there. I also needed leverage on the venue itself. I obtained a certified copy of the country club's internal accounts receivable ledger. I managed the investment portfolio for the general manager of that specific country club, and securing a favor was remarkably simple. I knew for a fact that Desmond and Valerie were exactly $30,000 behind on their membership dues. They were effectively delinquent and facing an impending lawsuit from the club board. They had managed to lease the grand ballroom for the New Year Eve gala purely on a promise of future payment, writing a bad check that was guaranteed to bounce the moment the banks opened after the holiday. The stage was perfectly set. They had built a glittering, elaborate theater of lies, and I held the match that would burn it to the ground. On New Year Eve, I did not dress to blend in. I dressed for a funeral, their funeral. I bypassed my usual subdued corporate attire and commissioned a custom-tailored floor-length crimson designer gown that hugged every curve perfectly. The color was bold, unapologetic, and entirely lethal. I paired the gown with diamond drop earrings and a classic sharp red lip. I looked like a woman who managed millions of dollars before breakfast. I looked like a woman who held the executioner's axe and was entirely eager to swing it. At 11:15 at night, just as the gala was reaching its absolute peak, I pulled up to the grand entrance of the country club. I did not arrive quietly in a rideshare. I did not drive my practical daily sedan. I arrived in the exact same midnight blue $80,000 BMW X7 my father had committed a felony to buy. The valet rushed forward to open my door, his eyes widening at the immaculate luxury vehicle. I stepped out of the BMW, handing him the master key fob with a crisp $100 bill. "Keep it parked right up front in the VIP circle," I instructed him, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "I will not be staying long." I walked up the grand, sweeping stone staircase to the main ballroom. The heavy mahogany double doors were propped wide open, and the sound of a live jazz band spilled out into the opulent lobby. The room was dripping in forced, expensive elegance. There were massive, towering ice sculptures, overflowing champagne fountains, and hundreds of Atlanta's most wealthy and influential residents dressed in their absolute finest tuxedos and evening gowns. I did not hesitate for a single second. I walked straight past the welcome table, ignoring the frantic, panicked whispers of the event staff who recognized me and knew I was not on the approved guest list. I strode directly into the center of the ballroom, heading straight for the velvet-roped VIP section, where my family was currently holding court. The crowd parted for me instinctively. When you walk with absolute unbothered authority, people move out of your way. I felt the eyes of every investor socialite and gossiping neighbor lock onto my crimson gown. The whispers started immediately spreading across the room like a shockwave as they recognized the woman who was supposedly locked away in a psychiatric ward. My mother, Valerie, was the first to see me. She was standing next to a carved swan ice sculpture holding a crystal glass of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke some local politician had just made. The laughter died in her throat the exact second she made eye contact with me. Her face went entirely ashen, losing every drop of color, and the champagne flute in her hand trembled so violently the liquid spilled over the rim. Kiara and Connor were sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the center of the VIP area, surrounded by a group of young affluent investors. Connor was desperately trying to court for his fake entrepreneurial ventures. Kiara looked up, saw me walking toward them, and immediately grabbed her husband's arm in a blind, terrified panic. Connor abruptly stood up from the plush velvet sofa, spilling his expensive bourbon onto the custom upholstery. The forced, arrogant charm he had been using to court the wealthy Atlanta investors evaporated in a single heartbeat. He marched directly toward the velvet rope barrier that separated the VIP section from the rest of the grand ballroom, acting as the aggressive gatekeeper to a kingdom he did not even own. Kiara scrambled to her feet right behind him. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, taking in the hundreds of elite guests who had completely stopped their conversations to watch the drama unfold. She desperately flagged down a passing event coordinator, her voice shrill and trembling with absolute panic. "Get security over here right now," Kiara shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. "She is not on the guest list. She is a trespasser. She is highly unstable. You need to remove her from the premises immediately." The country club event staff hesitated. Two heavily built security guards in dark tailored suits approached the VIP perimeter, but they stopped a few feet away. I did not look like a deranged trespasser. I looked like the wealthiest woman in the entire building. When you carry yourself with absolute unwavering authority, people naturally second-guess their orders to remove you. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for a much clearer directive before they dared to touch a woman wearing a custom crimson designer gown and diamonds. Sensing the guards' hesitation, Connor decided to take matters into his own hands. He aggressively unhooked the velvet rope and stepped out of the VIP section, closing the distance between us until he was standing mere inches away from me. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical height to intimidate me. I could smell the cheap liquor on his breath mixed with the nervous sweat that was rapidly dampening his stiff designer collar. "What the hell do you think you are doing here, Jada?" Connor demanded, his voice booming loud enough to echo entirely over the live jazz band playing in the corner. "You are not welcome here. Your parents officially cut you off for a very good reason. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now before you humiliate yourself even more than you already have." I did not take a single step back. I did not break eye contact. I looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a forensic auditor examining a bankrupt ledger. My total silence infuriated him. It completely stripped him of the reactive emotional argument he desperately wanted to have. He needed me to scream. He needed me to act out the aggressive, unstable narrative he had been selling to the Atlanta high society all night. When I offered him nothing but absolute lethal stillness, he aggressively escalated his attack. He turned his body slightly, ensuring that the affluent investors sitting on the velvet sofa behind him could hear every single word he was about to say. He was putting on a theatrical performance for them, trying to project the image of a protective, powerful patriarch defending his fragile wife from a dangerous outsider. "You are nothing but a bitter, lonely fraud," Connor sneered, leaning his face aggressively close to mine. "You are so violently jealous of Kiara and the beautiful, successful life we have built that it literally broke your mind. You think your little corporate title means something in the real world. It means absolutely nothing. Nobody here wants to deal with your pathetic mental breakdowns. You are a sad, isolated woman who will spend the rest of her life surrounded by spreadsheets because no man will ever want to deal with your miserable attitude." Loud gasps erupted from the surrounding crowd. The wealthy socialites covered their mouths, whispering furiously to one another as the tension in the room skyrocketed. Connor smiled, a sickeningly smug expression twisting his features. He truly believed he had just delivered a fatal blow. He thought he had successfully and publicly shamed me into submission. He incorrectly assumed that attacking my marital status and weaponizing my independence in front of a crowd would shatter my confidence and force me to retreat. He was profoundly mistaken. I did not feel an ounce of shame. I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute lethal clarity. I looked right past Connor's shoulder and locked eyes with the group of investors he had been trying to pitch all evening. They were older, seasoned businessmen who knew a desperate con artist when they saw one. They were watching Connor's unhinged emotional outburst with deep, uncomfortable skepticism. Connor was actively destroying his own professional credibility, and he was too blindingly arrogant to even realize it. I finally broke my silence. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. When you speak the absolute truth, the entire room quiets down to listen. I am not here to embarrass myself, Connor. I stated, my tone perfectly modulated and icy cold. I am also not here to debate my personal life with a man who contributes absolutely zero financial value to society. I am here to deliver some highly sensitive financial documents to the actual owners of this establishment. Connor blinked, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced nervously down at the sleek leather portfolio securely tucked under my arm. He had no idea what was inside it, but his inherent cowardice spiked instantly at the mere mention of financial documents. He raised his hand as if he were going to grab my arm and physically force me toward the ballroom exit. I shifted my gaze to his raised hand and delivered a warning so sharp it practically froze the air between us. If you touch me, I will have you arrested for assault before the jazz band finishes their next song, I promised him. The two security guards standing nearby immediately stepped forward, placing themselves firmly between us. They were no longer there to throw me out. They were there to ensure Connor did not lay a single finger on a high-profile guest. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing Connor to either hold his ground and face security or retreat entirely. He instinctively took a massive step back, his physical intimidation tactic crumbling into dust the exact second I challenged his space. I stepped right past him, crossing the threshold into the VIP section without waiting for an invitation. Kiara shrieked again, retreating behind the velvet sofa as if I were carrying a loaded weapon. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, pretending she was dialing for help, but she was too paralyzed by pure panic to actually press any buttons. I turned to face the entire VIP enclosure, ensuring my voice carried to my mother, who was still frozen by the melting ice sculpture, and to my father, who had just emerged from the country club bar, his face draining of all color as he spotted my crimson gown. I did not break my stride. I walked directly toward the center table, where the investors were seated, projecting total, absolute command of the environment. Connor scrambled clumsily behind me, his heavy footsteps thudding against the carpet as he desperately tried to catch up and intercept me. He was panting completely, losing the polished, affluent facade he had spent the entire evening trying to maintain. "You cannot be in here," Connor stammered, his voice cracking with pure, unchecked desperation. "This is a private event. You have no right to crash our celebration." I stopped perfectly positioned in the absolute center of their glamorous lie. I slowly turned to face my entire family. The wealthy investors watched me with rapt attention, waiting to see my next move. The socialites leaned in closer, completely desperate to hear every single word I was about to say. The stage was flawlessly set, and the audience was entirely captivated. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer weight of my silence commanded the entire ballroom. I looked past my panicking family and locked eyes with Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the country club. He was standing near the edge of the velvet rope, looking incredibly anxious about the escalating scene. I raised my hand and signaled for him to approach. He stepped forward, hesitantly smoothing his tailored jacket. "Mr. Sterling," I said, projecting my voice so it carried effortlessly over the soft jazz music. "I believe you have been trying to collect a rather substantial debt from the hosts of this evening's gala." My father Desmond let out a strangled gasp. He lunged forward from the bar, but his legs seemed to give out beneath him, causing him to stumble heavily against a cocktail table. I unzipped my sleek leather portfolio and extracted a crisp, sealed envelope. I handed it directly to the general manager. Inside that envelope is a certified cashier check covering the $30,000 my parents currently owe this establishment in delinquent membership dues, I announced. The crowd erupted into a chorus of shocked murmurs. I held up my hand to silence the room before delivering the rest of the devastating truth. I am paying this debt on their behalf strictly to compensate the hard-working waitstaff and event coordinators who were about to be stiffed. Because the check my father wrote to secure this ballroom tonight is going to bounce the second the banks open on Monday morning. My mother Valerie let out a high-pitched, agonizing wail. She grabbed the edge of an ice sculpture, her manicured nails scraping desperately against the frozen swan as her knees buckled. For those of you who have been told that my father's recent arrest was a simple misunderstanding, let me clarify the reality. I continued, turning slowly to address the horrified faces of the Buckhead elite. Desmond and Valerie are completely insolvent. They do not own their home. They do not own their cars. They are currently out on bail for felony identity theft, and they are officially filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy next week. The champagne you are drinking and the caviar you are eating were purchased with stolen credit. The wealthy investors sitting on the plush velvet sofa immediately set down their drinks, as if the crystal glasses were suddenly radioactive. They looked at my father with absolute unmasked disgust. The facade was completely shattered. The glittering illusion of Atlanta high society wealth had been violently ripped away, leaving my parents exposed as nothing more than desperate criminals drowning in debt. But I was not finished. I had one more execution to carry out. Connor saw the ship sinking and immediately tried to scramble onto a lifeboat. The cowardly grifter threw his hands up in the air, attempting to physically distance himself from my parents. I had no idea, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Kiara and I had absolutely no idea they were broke. We are victims here too. I trusted Desmond with my consulting business. He lied to us. I slowly turned my focus entirely onto Connor. The pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes was magnificent. "Your consulting business, Connor?" I asked, a predatory smile spreading across my face. "Is that what we are calling felony embezzlement these days?" Connor froze. All the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. I reached into my leather portfolio one last time and pulled out a thick stack of financial documents, securely bound in a sleek black folder. I did not hand this folder to the general manager. I walked directly over to the group of affluent investors Connor had been desperately trying to pitch all evening. I dropped the forensic audit directly onto the glass coffee table right in front of them. "I highly suggest you read that audit before you even consider giving this man a single dime of your capital," I told the investors. "Because Connor has not been working a legitimate job for the past 2 years. He has been systematically siphoning the last remaining drops of a commercial loan out of my father's failing company." The lead investor, an older man with silver hair, picked up the folder and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the highlighted spreadsheets and bank transfer records. He scoffed, shaking his head in absolute revulsion before tossing the folder back onto the table. I turned back to face my sister Kiara. She was shaking violently, her perfect holiday makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Your husband is a thief, Kiara," I stated clearly, making sure every single guest in the ballroom heard the brutal reality of her perfect marriage. "He set up a series of shell companies to drain our father's accounts, but he did not use that money to build a business or provide for you. He used it to pay off massive illegal sports gambling debts to offshore bookies. He is hundreds of thousands of dollars in the hole, and he has been stealing from your own parents to save his own skin. He is a parasite." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick carpet. Kiara stared at Connor. Her eyes were wide, frantically searching his face for a denial. She needed him to fight back. She needed him to protect their manufactured image. "Tell her she is lying!" Kiara screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet room. Connor, tell them she is making this up. Tell them it is a lie. Connor looked at the forensic audit sitting on the glass table. He looked at the furious disgust on the investors' faces. He looked at me standing there in my crimson gown holding the absolute undeniable truth. He could not say a word. He just stood there swallowing hard, completely paralyzed by his own exposure. His silence was the loudest confession in the entire room. Kiara completely snapped. The golden child, the perfect obedient daughter, whose entire identity was wrapped up in her flawless marriage, suddenly realized the horrifying truth. She was legally bound to a broke gambling addict who had just destroyed her family's last chance at survival. She let out a guttural scream of pure, unchecked rage. She launched herself at Connor, her fists flying, hitting him squarely in the chest. "You ruined my life," she shrieked, beating against his expensive tuxedo. "You stole from us! You are a liar! You are a complete fraud!" Connor threw his arms up, trying to shield his face, stumbling backward over the velvet rope to escape his wife's frantic blows. His heel caught the edge of a cocktail table, sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The glasses shattered spectacularly across the polished hardwood, scattering sharp fragments everywhere. At the exact same moment, my mother finally gave out. Valerie collapsed completely onto the floor, her designer gown pooling around her as she sobbed hysterically into her hands. The social humiliation was simply too much for her fragile ego to bear. Her wealthy friends were actively backing away from her, whispering furiously, shielding their faces from the spectacular implosion of her dynasty. Nobody moved to help her up. Nobody offered her a napkin. They just watched her weep. My father stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the far wall. He was a completely broken man who had gambled his family's future on a lie and lost absolutely everything. He had traded his successful self-sufficient daughter for a cowardly thief of a son-in-law, and the cost of that trade had just bankrupted his entire existence. I stood in the center of the wreckage, perfectly untouched by the chaos swirling around me. I had delivered the accountability they had spent my entire life trying to avoid. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to use this gala to humiliate me. Instead, I gave them a masterpiece of their own destruction. A waiter stood frozen nearby, holding a silver tray with a single untouched glass of champagne. I calmly reached out and picked up the crystal flute. I took a slow, deliberate sip, the crisp bubbles cold and refreshing against my tongue. I did not offer them a parting insult. I did not gloat. I did not need to scream to be heard. True power does not require a victory speech. I simply turned my back on the screaming match unfolding in the VIP section. I walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, my crimson gown trailing elegantly behind me. The crowd parted for me in absolute stunned silence, watching me glide toward the exit. The whispers had stopped entirely. I walked out the heavy mahogany doors, leaving them to burn in the ashes of their own greed. I stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air, taking a deep breath of absolute unburdened freedom. The valet already had the midnight blue BMW running its engine, purring perfectly at the front of the curb. I tipped him again, slid into the plush leather driver's seat, and drove off into the new year, leaving their shattered world firmly in my rearview mirror. Fast forward, exactly 6 months. The suffocating humidity of an Atlanta summer had settled over the city, but the climate control in my corner office remained perfectly crisp. I sat at my mahogany desk, signing off on a highly profitable merger for one of my top corporate clients, when an encrypted email from my legal counsel appeared on my monitor. Attached was the final court disposition regarding the state of Georgia versus Desmond. Reading the cold legal jargon on those pristine digital pages was the absolute perfect conclusion to the chaotic theater my family had forced me to endure. My father did not go to trial. Narcissists rarely possess the actual stamina required to stand in a courtroom and defend their lies under the brutal scrutiny of cross-examination. When his overworked public defender reviewed the pristine mountain of financial evidence I had handed over to the police, Desmond realized he had absolutely zero leverage. He was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. So the proud, arrogant patriarch who spent his entire life demanding unearned respect from everyone around him took the coward's way out. He accepted a plea deal, Desmond stood before a federal judge stripped of his country club memberships and his fake aristocratic bravado and formally pled guilty to felony identity theft. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, he was placed on 5 years of strict, highly monitored probation. The terms of his release were absolutely devastating to his fragile ego. He was ordered to pay steep restitution fines. He was legally barred from opening any new lines of credit or acting as a financial guarantor for anyone. He had to report weekly to a probation officer who did not care about his tailored suits or his practiced charismatic smile. He was officially and permanently branded as a convicted felon. The legal fees and the immediate demand for restitution triggered the final unavoidable collapse of my parents' financial house of cards. The bank did not care about my mother's social standing or her desperate, tearful phone calls to the loan officers. The bank cared about capital, and my parents had absolutely none left. Foreclosure proceedings moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency. 2 months after the New Year Eve gala, the bank officially seized the sprawling Atlanta McMansion. There was no dignified exit. The repossession was a matter of public record, listed in local real estate registries for every single one of their former high society friends to see. I heard through the grapevine that a massive moving truck was parked in the same circular driveway where the midnight blue BMW had briefly sat. My mother, Valerie, had to stand on the front lawn and watch a liquidation company haul away her imported luxury furniture and her fake antique artwork to cover their outstanding debts. They were violently ejected from the Buckhead elite and forced to relocate to a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment in a heavily congested zip code miles away from their former glory. Valerie had to trade her charity luncheons and luxury shopping sprees for extreme couponing and budgeting. I was told she started wearing oversized designer sunglasses to the discount grocery store, terrified that someone from her former bridge club might recognize her pushing a squeaky cart down the clearance aisle. Her entire identity was tied to an illusion of wealth, and without it, she was nothing more than a bitter, hollow shell of a woman living in a complex with thin walls and shared laundry facilities. But the most spectacular and satisfying downfall belonged entirely to Kiara and her parasitic husband. The forensic audit I dropped on the glass coffee table at the country club gala did not just ruin Connor's reputation. It triggered an active investigation by state authorities into his fraudulent shell companies. The wealthy investors Connor had been desperately trying to court that night immediately severed all ties with him, blacklisting him completely from the Atlanta business community. Without new investors to scam, and with my father's business officially bankrupt and dissolved, Connor's pipeline of stolen cash completely dried up. He was drowning in illegal sports gambling debts, and the offshore bookies he owed were not the type of men who sent polite collection letters. Connor needed a bailout, but the bank of Desmond and Valerie was permanently closed, and I was entirely untouchable. So Connor did exactly what a parasite does when the host body finally dies. He detached. He did not offer Kiara a tearful goodbye. He did not sit down with his wife to discuss a repayment plan for the massive financial ruin he had caused. He simply waited until Kiara left their leased luxury apartment to run an errand, and he packed a single duffel bag. He emptied whatever loose cash remained in their joint checking account and walked out the door. He abandoned his wife, his fake corporate title, and the mountain of legal liabilities he had created, fleeing across state lines to avoid the impending embezzlement charges and the people looking to collect his gambling debts. Kiara returned to an empty apartment and a devastating reality check. The golden child, who had spent her entire 29 years floating on a cloud of unearned privilege and subsidized luxury, was suddenly thrust into the brutal, unforgiving real world. Connor's cowardly exit proved that his loyalty was never to Kiara. His loyalty was exclusively to her parents' wallets. He had married an aesthetic, expecting a lifetime of free rides, and the exact second the funds ran out, his supposed devotion evaporated into thin air. He left Kiara holding the bag for every single disaster they had accumulated together. Because she had willingly co-signed his lifestyle, Kiara was legally tethered to his financial wreckage. The luxury apartment complex evicted her when the rent bounced. The credit cards, maxed out under both of their names, went into immediate default, ruining her credit score beyond repair. Her designer bags and expensive jewelry had to be sold off to online consignment shops just to keep the lights on and buy groceries. For the first time in her entire life, the golden child had absolutely no one to rescue her. Desmond and Valerie could barely afford the rent on their cramped two-bedroom apartment, let alone bail out their precious youngest daughter. Kiara could not call me to fix it because her number was permanently blocked, and she knew I would rather burn my own cash than hand her a single dime. The reality of her situation forced Kiara to do the one thing she had actively avoided her entire adult life. She had to get a job. The woman who used to mock my corporate work ethic and label my independence as a tragic flaw was forced to accept a minimum wage retail position at a local mall just to survive. She spends her days standing on her feet folding clothes and dealing with demanding customers stripped entirely of the unearned arrogance she used to flaunt at our family dinners. The grand illusion was over. My family had spent a decade treating me like a disposable asset, prioritizing a worthless grifter simply because he fit their desired demographic and stroked their egos. They had sacrificed their actual self-made daughter to prop up a house of cards. Now the cards were scattered across the floor, and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. I closed the encrypted email from my attorney and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the bustling traffic of downtown Atlanta move far below me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for Desmond, Valerie, Kiara, or Connor. Pity is a luxury reserved for those who fall victim to unfortunate circumstances beyond their control. My family did not fall victim to anything. They fell victim to their own unchecked greed, their own staggering arrogance, and their own malicious entitlement. I turned my attention back to the glowing monitors on my desk, preparing to launch the next phase of my life, entirely unburdened by the toxic weight of my past. The very first order of business on my new agenda was liquidating the physical evidence of their betrayal. I did not want the midnight blue BMW X7. It was a beautiful piece of modern German engineering, but to me, it was nothing more than a rolling crime scene. It carried the stench of my father's financial desperation and my sister's unearned entitlement. I had absolutely zero intention of keeping it parked in my garage as a daily reminder of their toxic behavior. I did not even want to drive it to a dealership. I made one phone call to an elite luxury auto broker based in Buckhead. Because the vehicle had less than 50 miles on the odometer and a pristine, legally binding title registered exclusively in my name, the transaction was incredibly seamless. The broker arrived at my townhouse the very next morning with a flatbed transport truck and a certified cashier check. I handed over the sleek master key fob and stood on my porch watching them load the massive luxury SUV onto the ramp. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure as the truck disappeared down the street, taking the last remaining physical tie to my biological family with it. I walked back into my house, holding a check for nearly $75,000. I did not need this capital for my wealth management firm. I certainly did not need it for my personal investment accounts. I wanted to transform this stolen money into something incredibly powerful. I wanted to build a weapon that would actively dismantle the exact kind of generational curse my parents had tried to pass down to me. I took every single cent from the sale of that vehicle and used it as the foundational seed capital for a brand new philanthropic initiative. I launched a comprehensive financial literacy scholarship specifically designed for young African American women entering college in the Atlanta metropolitan area. I flatly refused to let the narrative of that stolen car end with my family's staggering greed. I turned their felony into a masterclass on asset protection. The scholarship program is not just about writing a tuition check for these young women. It is an intensive, rigorous mentorship boot camp. I personally teach my cohorts the exact financial defense mechanisms I use to protect my own empire. We cover the absolute essentials of capital management in the modern world. I sit in conference rooms with these brilliant, ambitious Black girls, and I teach them how to lock down their Social Security numbers so no desperate relative can ever open a fraudulent utility bill or auto loan in their name. I show them how to read a credit report, how to aggressively negotiate a starting corporate salary, and how to build a diversified investment portfolio from their very first paycheck. But the most important lesson I teach these young women is the psychological aspect of wealth and family dynamics. I teach them that the word no is a complete sentence. I teach them how to identify financial abuse when it comes disguised as cultural obligation or familial respect. I look these young women in the eyes, and I tell them that they are not responsible for funding the reckless choices of the adults who raised them. We talk about the heavy burden of being the first successful person in a struggling family and how to navigate the guilt trips that inevitably follow. I teach them to build their own empires, to protect their credit scores with their lives, and to absolutely never rely on a man, a parent, or a societal expectation to secure their financial freedom. Watching these young women graduate from my program, stepping into the corporate world with ironclad boundaries and financial savvy, is the greatest return on investment I have ever experienced. Transforming my trauma into a tangible resource for the next generation allowed me to completely close the door on my past. Today, my life is an absolute masterclass in peace. The suffocating anxiety that used to define my entire existence has completely vanished. My phone no longer rings at midnight with frantic demands for emergency cash to cover a bounced country club check. I do not spend my holidays walking on eggshells, terrified of a backhanded compliment, a public humiliation, or a passive-aggressive racist jab from a useless brother-in-law. My townhouse is a sanctuary of absolute calm. When I host dinner parties now, my dining table is not filled with bitter relatives performing a fake pantomime of high society wealth. My table is surrounded by my chosen family. I sit across from other self-made Black women entrepreneurs, corporate attorneys, and executives who truly understand the weight of ambition. We drink expensive wine that we actually paid for with our own hard-earned money. We celebrate each other's corporate acquisitions, promotions, and personal growth without a single ounce of jealousy. There is no competition in my home over who has the better husband or the flashiest leased car. There is only genuine mutual respect and unwavering support. We protect each other's peace, and we fiercely defend each other's boundaries. If one of us is struggling, we offer real solutions, not theatrical pity. I have built a life that is so deeply fulfilling and so thoroughly insulated from toxic behavior that my biological parents and sister feel like nothing more than a distant cautionary tale. I look at my reflection in the mirror every single morning, and I see a woman who fought a brutal, relentless war for her own independence and won a flawless, decisive victory. I did not just survive their attempts to break me. I used the very stones they threw at me to build a fortress they can never enter. Blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty, respect, and boundaries do. The best revenge isn't anger. It is unbothered, massive success. Have you ever had to use the law to protect yourself from your own family? Drop your story in the comments. Hit like and subscribe, and remember, never let anyone guilt you into financing your own disrespect. The most profound lesson from this story is that financial independence serves as your ultimate shield against toxic family dynamics. Blood relations do not guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. Sometimes they merely create an illusion of obligation that manipulative people exploit for their own selfish gain. When you establish firm boundaries and protect your assets with relentless discipline, you completely strip abusers of their power over you. True family is never defined by shared DNA, but by mutual respect and unwavering support. Ultimately, the greatest revenge against those who try to diminish your worth is achieving unbothered, massive success. Drop your own story of establishing boundaries and overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below. And do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering content.